All right, welcome everyone. So today we're going to talk about serverless computing and more in particular Azure Functions. So real quick about myself, I'm the data and solution architect at Progressive Health. We do physical rehab, so we run clinics in 9 different states, but we also do, we're actually inside of factories and we test every single job on a factory line, and then when people come in, we test those people. So, I came in this job about a year and a half ago, and one of the things we needed was, they had this old application that was very monolithic and such, and we were looking for ways to better build that out, better flexibility and such. And that's when we started doing some serverless architecture, and I'm using those lessons here for this talk today. So sure enough, they are doing Slack for questions. I do have Slack open up. I'll be honest, whether I actually notice it pop up, I don't know. Either that or it'll really distract me, one of the two. But we'll figure that out if someone asks a question. And I will follow along afterwards. So if you have a question afterwards, I will answer in that Slack channel. So let's start with, what is serverless? And sure enough, I will be the first one to tell you I hate the name serverless because obviously there are servers in there, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Really, to start off, let's talk about a little story, right, and talk about the evolution of application development. And we look at it, when we started off, especially in the old days, we would go out, we'd figure out what hardware we needed, spec it out, go get that. We figure out what framework we're using, whether that was Java or .NET, and any of the different libraries we needed for that, and get those installed. We wonder about what, have to deal with the operating system and getting the right versions and getting it patched. And then at some point, somehow, we got that deployed to out to the internet so that our customers could see those sites. This worked, but the problem was there were a lot of questions that really had nothing to do with application development. We had to ask, what we're going to do for backup for those apps, how we're going to handle physical security, scaling, monitoring, the hardware and the application, and so many other things, right? But the problem was, these were not our core competencies. But like I said, growing up in this industry, I had to not only know, how to build my application, I had to know how to serve it up. There we go. Then we move into infrastructure as a service. And here, now, this is really the start of the cloud, right? And everything's out in the cloud, and things are more configurable and easier to do. But we still had a lot of questions. It was just now the questions were a little bit more organized because most of the cloud vendors were good about at least showing us in a wizard type thing. But we were having to worry about what server we were doing and when we were going to patch it and we were going to back it up and so forth. And then comes in platform as a service. Now here's where, we start getting a whole lot better. Sure enough, this is how we host our own sites, right? It's all platform as a service. And this does make a whole lot more sense because now, your configurations are a whole lot less because they handle most of everything you need. You don't worry about the operating system. You don't worry about the, how you're going to patch it because that's taken care of. But we still have to ask questions like, what size of the server we need, and when are we going to scale it up and scale it down, and so forth. Funny part, my watch is going crazy, which is. But now, what we have is serverless, right? And with serverless, we're not having to worry about what server we're going to put it on, how we're going to scale it up. This is basically, all taken care of for us. And that's why it has the name serverless, because we're not worried about the server. Because now, all you're worried about is how to build your application to best suit your business needs. So if we want to look at a definition, looking at the definition of serverless is a little bit difficult, partially because the term has kind of been used for multiple different things. If we really look at the first area, this is what a lot of the general public thinks of the cloud, right? Those services out there that will provide really your back end. And that's why these are really more a back end as a service. Think of like your Azure cloud or your, the Office grid, right? Where you're able to get all these services, So that is serverless in a sense, but it's not really what we're looking here. Really what we're looking at is more of, where all you're worried about is the code itself, and you're getting those compute containers to run that code. And really, personally, I like the term functions as a service, right? I mean, this is really what we're doing, right? And yes, that's Azure's term is Azure Functions, but really no matter whether you're doing Azure, IBM, AWS, what have you, it's all really the same. So as far as benefit, or what is serverless, so it's abstraction of servers, right? So we're not worried about those servers. We're not standing them up and so forth. It's event driven, right? When I get into my code demos, you'll see this, right? Because everything is an event, whether it's an Htp trigger or it's a timer event or what have you. It's all event driven. And really one of the more important parts, it's micro billing, right? You're only paying for what you're using, right? So if you think even with PaaS, right, where the platform as a service, I'm still having to stand up extra servers just to make sure I can handle, if I'm a retailer, oh my God, when December comes around and all of a sudden sales hit up a whole lot more. With this, we don't have to worry about that because it'll automatically scale up for us. And sure enough, I was on the plane the other day and I was reading this article, and I don't remember the exact number, but basically I think it was, they said they had customers where they saw people going from $10,000 a month to $370 a month, right? Same level of services, same level of executions, but I mean, that just shows you the savings we can get in with this. Some other benefits, you're managing your app, you're not managing the server, right? So it allows the app team to do what it does right? It's just dealing with the application itself. Reduce DevOps. I mean, now I'll get this. Some of it actually gets a little bit more, depending on how you architect your serverless stuff. But in general, it is reduced DevOps. There's fewer steps, there's fewer things to worry about. And because of all that, it's faster time to market, right? I mean, you can deploy these in a heartbeat because they are individual functions. And that's one of the reasons why we're looking at going this way. We're in the middle of building a whole new API, and it's all serverless. And part of the reason is because I can change part of those, any one of those different methods without it impacting anything else. Which means I can pretty much take I don't have to take down a whole app just to get updated services. And really, if we think about the scaling of services, we start off, and you think about it, you have the monolith, right? You have, with a lot of the applications that we saw, really, 5 years ago, we're doing a whole lot better. Because now, you see a lot of these microservices. So, we're breaking them up into logical units. But really, when we talk about serverless and we talk about functions as a service, each individual function is of itself. Now, you'll notice you're not having to set up different services, right? They're just individual objects within there. But those functions, they run as themselves. And that's why, I've seen this term recently, and I really like this. I mean, this is really nano services. Because again, it's that individual function that you're handling. And of course, with any architecture and technology, there are some challenges. Number one is complexity. Because, again, with that big monolith application, you went to one place to update your code and to manage the code. So obviously here, you're going to have things in more places. There's still good ways to manage all that, but you're still going to have, code all over the place in one sense. There's organizational support. You'll notice I talked about we're not worried about the servers. We're not worried about that. Well, if you've got an IT team, they might not be too happy about that. Although again, it's still, they could be. Because actually, like I'll talk about in a moment, Azure Functions is open source. I can actually run locally if I really wanted to. So there still is the opportunity for that. But obviously there is that support that you would need to get. And then the other time, if you need to do, if your code requires runtime, optimization, so you have something that really needs to get deep into the operating system, then serverless might be a problem, right? Now, most of the different vendors, they do allow for, for packages and so forth that kind of help with that, but still, you're not really getting into that runtime because again, you don't care about it with the runtime for the most part. So as far as different options, what's actually interesting, the first pay-as-you-go code execution platform was this thing called Zimke. I actually never heard of it because it actually failed back in 2006. But it shows you this has been around for a while, so people have been doing this, but it's really the last couple of years. And that's why now you see all the major vendors, they have something, right? Google has its cloud functions. There's Amazon Lambdas, which is extremely popular. The cloud functions from IBM, which is using some open source technology. and then even Auth0 has their web task. And then we have Azure. And when we look at Azure, there's really a couple different options within Azure. So there are the Azure Functions, right? Which we're going to spend more time here in a moment. But here we're talking about event-driven computer experience, right? Executing your code in the need of an event. There's also logic apps. So basically think of workflows, right? So if you think of like an order processing system, and take the order would be one step, send it over for approval and so forth. So you can do all these different steps with logic apps. And then Event Grid, I can't talk a whole lot about Event Grid because I actually haven't dealt with this a whole lot. But basically this is allowing you to take in events coming from multiple different Azure sources and even on-prem sources. But along with that, and again, if we look at the fuller definition of serverless, there are things like the databases, right? Azure SQL and Azure MySQL and Progress and Cosmos DB. You've got the storages, right? Where again, I just have a place to store my data that I need. I don't have to worry about how it's stored. There's a lot of security, like Active Directory. Sure enough, our company, we're looking at right now to actually get rid of our on-prem Active Directory. It does help that we're 1,000 people, but only 40 are in the corporate office. So why have it there? IoT, analytics, and then you have the intelligence, which includes all the artificial intelligence type things and the cognitive services. Which if you have any interest in that, Azure really I think has stolen the market on there. And there's supposed to be some really big. Next week is Microsoft Build. And there's supposed to be some really interesting announcements. I don't know what, but I foresee some big things coming up next week. So we're gonna stick with Azure Functions in particular because these are really the easiest things to implement and really gets you into serverless computing. So sure enough, you really can't talk about a Microsoft technology without the cake diagram. I think that's required, and I think Microsoft would shoot me if I didn't put something like this up here. Really, the important part I wanted to talk about in here is that everything's built on top of the Azure App Service and WebJobs SDK. And you'll notice WebJobs is actually a form of serverless. It's really something Microsoft, it's still supported, but they're really trying to get you into the newer possibilities. But and you'll notice when we talk about the features here in the next slide, it is because of the way how this architecture is built up that allows for all these features. And talking about features, we start off with choice of language. So there's the typical things you would think with Microsoft, right? So there's C#, there's JavaScript, and there's F#, right? But there's a lot of other languages that they support. So you really can come in no matter what language you're going to be talking about. So Java, Python, PHP, and so on. So that, they pretty much support whatever language you need. Oh. So, yes, so the question was about whether or not there was an optimal language or a language to stay away from. I would say the two optimal languages are C# and JavaScript. That is what they support, really natively. The other languages, they're all considered, other than F# is fully supported. The other languages are actually in experimental. So, Microsoft nowadays, everything is, we get the betas as live code. So they're all experimental. And I'm going to talk later on about the different runtime versions because there's actually two different versions of running of Azure Functions. And actually so Python, PHP, Bash, and PowerShell are not even supported by the new version yet. It's going to be, but so it does depend on what you're going to do. And the other part I would say, looking at C#, there's a difference between .NET Framework and .NET Core. So with .NET Core, you have to use the version 2, which is in preview mode. And there are some gotchas there. And I'm actually going to talk a little about that because one of the problems we're dealing with right now is some of those gotchas because some of the things you can easily generate, they haven't built that yet. So sure enough, next is the pay-per-use pricing model. And it is super cheap. I'm going to talk about pricing later on, but I mean, the pricing is unbelievable cheap. It's unbelievable what you can do with it. Bring your own dependencies. So, I was talking about this. You want your functions to be as simple as possible, but, and the other part of, just think about, the whole dry principle, right? Don't repeat yourself. Well, you can use your dependencies, whether it be NuGet, npm, you're allowed to bring those in. Integrated security. If you're doing Htp Trigger functions, which really is probably the bread and butter of Azure Functions, you can do all-auth, so you can use Active Directory, Facebook, if you're really that dangerous to use Facebook. But all those different OAuth possibilities. And then there's simplified integration. And Microsoft's really good about this. Sorry, I clicked too soon. They're really good about having those integrations, and they do. They have integrations with things like GitHub, Visual Studio, Team Services, and other things. And my slides are not in the right order, but that's all right. Flexible development. So sure enough, you can develop with you can develop on the portal, like we'll show in a moment. But your code can be in Visual Studio. It can be in Visual Studio version control. It can also be in GitHub. But also, your code can also be in different cloud sources, right? So OneDrive, Bitbucket, Dropbox, and also your local or external GitHubs repositories. And then the great thing about Microsoft, it's the new Microsoft, and it's all open source. And sure enough, I was doing this presentation a couple weeks ago, and someone asked, well, what do you mean by it's open source? And what I mean is you can actually go out to GitHub and you can see all the source code. Now, to me, the more important part about this is I actually can see what Microsoft's working on, right? I can see where they're at on features. And Microsoft over the years has always had ways to report issues or ask for code requests. I don't know if those old ways were really good. This really works, because the teams, on the Microsoft teams, they really are actually looking at this and they're responding to all these, when you put in requests and such. So what can you do with Azure Functions? Well, basically, it's great for processing data, integrating systems, working with IoT, simple APIs, and microservices. And on top of it, there are a number of templates that really help you get started. And along with that, it's all based upon triggers and bindings. So sure enough, there's all these different triggers you can use. So you can do a schedule. So let's say I need something to run every day at 8 a.m. or every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, right? You can have those type of schedules. There is the HTTP triggers, which, like I said, that's really what you see a lot of these functions doing. So you can do REST calls, you can do webhook calls. But you can also do things like blob storage, right? So you can have things where react when something goes into a blob. And one of the examples you see a lot of times with Microsoft, they'll show like doing content rating on images, right? So whether or not you should upload a picture onto your website based upon using some cognitive services actually to look at that image. So there's all these different things to include. They have some outside bindings, right? So I can use Twilio SMS text messages, send off a text based upon a result of a function, or send off an email using SendGrid. So I was talking about runtime versions. So sure enough, the current primary version is the 1.x. This supports .NET Framework 4.6, along with all the languages other than Java are supported with 1.x. So you can use that today. It's generally available. There is the Runtime 2.0 .x. And I'm one of these people, I like living by the sword, and so this is what I use a lot right now, partially because I want to use .NET Core, right? And so we are using some .NET Core functions. More importantly, I'm using Enterprise Function, or Enterprise Framework Core, and that's the reason why I'm using that. And because obviously this is cross-platform. Now, I actually don't worry about that, but one of the features with 2.0 or 2.x is that you can now have the choice of running on Windows or Linux. So if you have those things that need to run on a Linux container, or if you want to live dangerously and write your .NET Core code in Linux, and I say that because I've never done it. I know you can, but I haven't done that yet. And then, like I say, with here, this is where you get that extension for Java. So if you're a Java developer, here's where you want to start looking. Again, back to those caveats. There are some gotchas, right? It is still in development. there are still some things that are not done. The things that are done work. I have not seen actual problems with them, but like I say, there are things that make life easier that are just not there. And then they added some additional bindings. So you have the Microsoft Graph. That's what allows you to talk to your Outlook and your Excel files and so forth. And then they have this whole idea of durable functions. Really, if you ask me, this is kind of going out of the way of what serverless is supposed to be all about, because serverless is supposed to be simple. The durable is really for long running type functions. But yeah. So the nice part is you can develop how you want. And I talked about this a moment, but there is the Azure portal. So I can actually, I don't even have to open up a code editor. I can do everything on the Azure portal. Everything's right there. You can write your code in there and so forth. I mean, obviously you're not going to get IntelliSense and so forth, but it still works pretty well. There's Visual Studio, and really, to me, if you're going to do C#, this is the way to do it. This is the reason why we're all C# developers. If you're a C# developer, it's why you are, is because of Visual Studio. But also there is Visual Studio Code. So if you're doing the JavaScript, this is probably the way to do it. Because obviously you have that first class experience with Node. The nice part is anything I create, no matter where I create it, I can also open it up with Visual Code. And then the other part is the CLI, right? I kind of find it funny, being a Windows guy, and I've been a Windows guy since Windows 1. I do actually remember Windows 1. Not that anyone ever used it, but and I always thought it was funny. We try to get away from DOS Windows, and now that's all the rage now. But sure enough, the CLI tools are really nice, and actually, we'll see that in a moment, because actually, when we run code inside of Visual Studio, it actually is using the CLI to run those. So sure enough, let's test the waters and try to do a demo. So if we want to create our first function, I can go in here into the Azure dashboard, which is just portal.azure.com, and we will create a new resource. And it's really as simple as going to compute, or you can search for it, and I can type, click on Azure Function or the Function app. And it pretty much, just like anything else in Azure, the app name does have to be unique. I can tell you if I do type in Star Trek, it will not, there we go. It will not allow it, because actually I already have an app called Star Trek that I'm going to show in a moment. So you need to specify that. Just like anything else, your subscription, where your resource group is going to be. We can have a whole presentation about resource groups. There are two different hosting plans. I'll talk about that later, but pretty much anything you're going to do is the consumption plan. Your location. Again, if you don't have a whole experience with Azure, you try to find a location closest to where your users are going to be at. It's the whole thing of reducing latency. And then you do have to have a storage account. Don't worry about cost, because it puts hardly anything in there, and you're not going to get past the free level on this. But you do have to create a storage. Now, I'm not going to actually create this, because it actually takes about 2 to 3 minutes to create the function. So we're going to do the Julia Child thing and pretend like we did it. And so sure enough, here we have our Star Trek function. I've already created some functions, so just ignore that. But we're going to, so now we're ready to create our first function. It's as simple as clicking the plus button. And we're going to see, there we go. And then you get all your different options. I don't know why my screen wants to, there we go. Yeah, so there's all these different trigger options you can do. We're going to do an Htp trigger, just because that is, like I said, what you're normally going to be doing. So this is the whole idea, if you think in the REST idea, responding to a GET, a POST, a PUT, and so forth. You get to choose your language. Because I actually have turned this on to version 2. That's the reason why, because I was doing some testing. That's the reason why you only see a couple of different languages. And then there's other languages you cannot create within the portal directly. And then we have our name. I'm not going to worry about the name, although, if you attended Mike Dowland's talk this morning, that's actually a bad thing to have. Number 3 doesn't mean anything, but this is just a demo. Who really cares? And then you do have your authorization level, right? And think about this, you're passing server keys over, right? So, we can do function, we can do an admin type thing, or we can do it anonymous, if you want to live dangerously and just allow anyone to hit it without that key. Well, we're just going to keep it with a function, and we're going to create this. And after, there we go. And you'll see there it's created the function, right? It's pretty simple. Let's try to expand that just a little bit to make the code a little bit easier to read. But really, it's a pretty simple thing, right? I mean, so again, I did C#. So we're doing an async type task. Your methods always have to be called run. That's a requirement. And at least with an Htp trigger, it's going to take in that request message, and it's going to take in a trace writer for your log. And here in the example that they give you, you can see that it's going out there. It's just writing garbage out to the log to tell you that process a request. It's going to take in a query string of name, and here's where it's trying to grab that from the query string, because actually this will allow you to do a post. So that's why it's all, their sample code will actually show you to trying to get it out of the request body. And then at the end, if you have a name, basically it's going to say hello, whatever your name is, or it's going to say, hey, you need to pass that query string, right? So sure enough, we can, it's real simple as clicking on the get function URL, and we can get the function of what we just did. Actually, let me just, that's what I wanted. Click copy, and we can do something as simple as go to the browser, or we can go to Postman. If you've never used Postman, this is a great way if you're trying to build any type of API type thing. I mean, Postman's awesome, and I don't even scratch the service of it, and it still saves me all the time. But sure enough, I can pass in my URL that it gave me, and then I'm going to add in that query string of name. And click send, and as simple as that, you see we get back our response, right? Yes?
So can we use Azure Functions for apps with more business logic requiring library dependencies, or only for very simple purposes? In other words, piping data from endpoints into Cosmos?
No, yes, you definitely can use it for more business. Oh, the question was whether, basically, really short, was whether or not we can do more data intensive or more business processing and more, or just really simple functionality. And the answer is, yeah, you can do either, right? So you can do the simple stuff, or you can do more complex. And I'm actually, in a moment, the other demo I'm going to show actually shows that a little bit more, because I actually have a whole project laid out. So there's that's working. So sure enough, the next demo I'm going to show is actually creating this in Visual Studio. And really, it's about the same thing. We're going to go in here, we're going to create a new project just like anything else we would do in Visual Studio. We'll go down to the cloud options, and we're going to click Azure Functions. And I'm not going to actually create this project because it's just going to create the exact same type of project you saw in there. Well, actually, I am going to go a step further because it does at least come up with the option again. And it does allow me to either use the storage emulator so I can keep this local, or I can actually point to an actual different type of storage. But if we clicked OK, we're basically just going to get pretty much the same thing you saw on the portal. But in a moment, I'm going to show a better demo that actually, real life type things. So what I next want to talk about is deployment. And deployment actually is pretty simple, right? In the sense that there's a lot of different ways to deploy. Obviously, if I'm writing them directly in the portal, they're deployed right away. But if we're using something like Visual Studio or what have you, there are a lot of different options we can use here. To include, like I said, we can put things just in a Bitbucket or in a Dropbox. Or we can do full build and release type projects. And sure enough, so that's actually what my next option demo is going to be, is doing a continuous integration and deployment. And honestly, this is pretty simple. And actually going back to the last question. So here we actually see a project. Here's a full solution where, where we've got our entity object. I've separated out the actual context for the entity framework. That way I can plug in whatever one I actually, whether I need SQL Server or, Oracle database or what have you. I also created a function support just to kind of, just a DLL or class library, I should say, to just help out with some of the, make things simpler, again, the drive principle. And then sure enough, then we have our functions, right? And since we're at Star Trek, I decided to make a Avenger type demo. It's an extremely simple demo in the sense it's just team members and it has the name and height, weight, and that type of things. I will say when I show data, if you have complaints about it, you have to complain with Marvel because that's where it came from. So it's so for the true geeks in here, I didn't come up with the data, Marvel did. So and sure enough, we can, if I was like to look at. No, I'm not. Sorry. There we go. I apologize for that. So sure enough, I was just showing, so we have our different functions in here. And really, in here, where you start seeing, we're bringing in dependencies, right? So I have in here my chadgreen.avengers.data. I have the avengers.entity. And sure enough, the code is pretty much simple. We're just going in here. We are, it's a pretty typical get a list of things, right? About the only difference with anything else, but this is pretty, if you've done web APIs, it's pretty the same idea where, when we return the object, we're going to return an OK object result, passing in a result, or, typical of REST, if you don't have it, you're supposed to return a 404. And so that's what that's doing. And then sure enough, again, showing what happens with Azure and locally. So here it does fire off the CLI tools. And like I said, I love the logo for Azure Functions. I think it's really cool, and it definitely specifies what we're doing. And then at the bottom, you do see the list of functions that are created in here. And this is a simple, I can go in here and I can create, I can copy that URL, and again, go off to my Postman, and I can run the test of that. And I will say on this demo, I'm not, you notice there's no key in there. I've got it set up for anonymous, just to make it a little bit cleaner. But it, again, it returns just what you think. It's a 200, and we have our JSON results with all the different members of Avengers. I don't know if all these members are going to be in the movie. I haven't seen the movie yet, so because you'll notice that we go into here like Quicksilver or Quicksilver will probably be in there, but like we have a Spider Woman, Spider Woman, and that I didn't even know existed. But going on to now, when it's time to deploy this. So, there are multiple ways to do this. Actually, I could do this right within the Azure portal, but I do like doing it here because here I can, within VSTS, because here I can actually do the whole build, right? So, within the portal, it allows me to, once I have it built, I can grab it from like GitHub. But here I can actually do my build, and actually I tied the last step as to deploying it out. Now, I will say, if you're using, here's one of the gotchas. If you're using Team Foundation version control, and don't laugh, it's not that bad. But if you are using that, you actually have to do it this way. It's not built into the portal. And then now the one interesting part is as far as templates, actually the best template is an ASP.NET website. that actually has all the steps we need. And you can see we're defining the NuGet pack, where the NuGet version to use. We're restoring it. We're building a solution. Testing of our unit test, publish it out, and then the last thing is this deploy task. And really, the big things here, you specify your Azure subscription, your function, your app type. So I mean, because this is a generic task. So as you can see, we can do a web app, a Linux web app, and so forth. Here we're doing the function app, the name of that, and then the one thing, and this was actually one of the big things that I got tripped up. You have to change the default the setting on here. It actually has to be the artifact stage directory. I forgot what the default one is here. That really caught me up for a loop for a while. But once you've done that, you can run this build, and we're not going to run the build because it takes a couple minutes to run. Again, doing the Julia Child thing. It comes out, and here's all your functions, right? And again, they work just like they do, remotely. The one thing I will say, and the reason why I'm not clicking on any of these at the moment, so once you've deployed it from any type of repository, it puts them into a read-only mode, and that is, the thinking that, if your source is now that repository, not what's on the portal. So it goes into a read-only mode. You still can run them. You still have the test options that are built in here, but it just doesn't edit. The reason why I don't open this is because it's a little bit slow. That's the one thing I have noticed. Again, I've noticed this with version 2. I haven't been doing version 1 for a while, so I don't know if it's so much bad on version 1, but definitely in version 2, there's definitely slowness, which is why I'm not going into that at the moment. Sure.
First, when creating a new function, what is the storage account used for? Logs?
It's actually used, yes, the question was, sorry, I do keep on forgetting to do that. The question was, what is the storage account used for? And it's actually to store the code, is really what it's using for. And that's why I talked about how, you don't have to worry about the cost of that. You're never going to go past that free level. Because think about it, your code is pretty small. I mean, maybe if you have, once you put thousands of functions in there, maybe you'll start getting a cost.
Can you run apps that need an app startup?
Can you run apps that need an app startup? I'm not sure. I would say no, but that literally is a guess.
The last one, comparing Azure Functions to AWS Lambdas or Azure to AWS, which has more pros or more cons?
So the question was, which is pros and cons versus Azure Functions and Lambda. I have to admit, I don't do AWS, so I really couldn't speak to it. I'm a Microsoft fanboy. It really boils down to that. So I know the Microsoft side of it. So any other? Great. All right. So now the other thing we can do with Azure Functions is doing proxies. So you notice, I mean, the query strings are not the prettiest things in the world, and we're not doing that nice thing of like Avengers / team member /1 or that type of thing. But here we could do this with proxies, right? I mean, this allows me to take this long function name with a key and everything, and I can make it as easy as the hello world with a name, right? So if we wanted to look at that, that wasn't what I clicked on. Sure enough, this is. This is simple again, is given to the name. You give your template, and I'm going to show this more in a moment, an example. You can define your method. So I can, any type of HTTP method, or I can do selected methods, right? So if I only want to respond to a GET or what have you. And then we have our backend URL. And actually, this does not have to be just Azure Functions. This can be anything, right? So this is a great way. If we look at the all the expensive Azure, not Azure, but API management type tools, right? I mean, none of them are cheap. They do really great things. This is actually one way of handling some API management where you're doing some of that rewriting, right? Because you'll notice I have the ability to override the request or override the response. And sure enough, we can see that, like if we look at our get team member. So I've gone in here and I've defined the route to be my URL/team member/ID. And in there I have my parameter. And you'll notice in the request override, I'm overriding, basically, this is a very simplistic one, but I'm just simply doing, sending my a query string of an ID and pass in the ID that we received as part of the URL. So pretty simple thing. And again, I could show a demo. I could run it in Postman, but it just works, right? It's the same idea. And I didn't mean to go all the way to the front slide. And it still decided to do that, sorry. And now, I knew this was going to happen. My computer just started Monday. My computer just decides to freeze up every once in a while. Come on. There we go. All right, and then as I talked about before, we can, you can secure your Azure Functions with all these different types of OAuth providers. Actually, I don't know why I duplicated that content. So some things to think about: timeouts. So the default timeout is 5 minutes. Your maximum timeout you can set. You have to go into the configurations. You can set this for 10 minutes. Now again, that might not, actually, to me, that sounds like an incredible amount of time. That might not sound like a lot of time. The reason for that is because these functions are supposed to be simplistic, right? Even with doing the complicated logic, you're supposed to be able to do them within a short period of time. And the honest truth is if you need things more than 10 minutes, you either need to do, that's actually where the durable functions come in, the whole idea of passing state across. That's one of the benefits of durable functions that keep state. So you basically can break it up into multiple pieces. Or that's when you start looking at maybe I need to do a more traditional type hosting. So some common scenarios. We talk about what are good, but here's some common scenarios. Here we see where we're doing online orders. They're picked up from a queue, the process, and then the resulting data is stored in the database. And these are handled by Azure Functions in the different steps. A web application backend, right? So we have your colleagues are using a mobile backend to reimburse each other for lunch, and here the person who paid for lunch requests payment through his mobile app, and that triggers a notification on each one of the colleagues' phones. That can be handled through functions. Real-time file processing. I've talked earlier about the whole idea of being able to watch an image and make sure that its content is safe to put on a website. Or maybe you want to do OCR detection, so you can use functions for this. Stream processing, right? So here, grabbing in streams of telemetry data and, from a massive cloud app, and then processing that in near real time and storing it into a database for an analytics dashboard. Automation of scheduled tasks. Right. Actually, this was my first function that I wrote. And actually, it was before it was even functions. It was back to web jobs back then. But I literally had to replace one of those fun parts about when you replace a server, you find out server jobs that were on there that no one else knew that there were. That's exactly what we had. We had this job sitting on an NT server that was going out to a secure FTP every week to grab data for Aetna. And we replaced it with a scheduled task. You know, the scheduled task can run every 15 minutes, or like in our example, it runs every day. And sure enough, part of the reason why we run it every day is that way we know on Tuesdays it's supposed to be there, but if it fails, we know at the worst case we're going to have it the next day. Or extending SAS solutions, right? You know, so using your webhooks, right? I mean, webhooks are the hot thing, and you know, Azure Functions are a great way to respond and also build your webhooks. So pricing, you know, I talked about, you know, how great the pricing is, and it really is, because so first off, there are no upfront costs, right? So you set it up and you pay nothing until something actually hits it. You know, and you won't see that with any other type of service. Most any other type of service, you're paying for it right away. There's no termination fees. Actually, I don't know if Azure has any termination fees anywhere, but that is one of the features, right? Is there's no termination fees. And again, you pay for only what you use. So, yes?
So, are the proxy configuration files packaged with the function or a separate deployable artifact?
They are a separate deployable artifact. And I could not tell you, I mean, so far all I've ever done with proxies is within the portal itself, just because it makes it a lot easier. I do believe there is a way to export them out and then put them in like a source control, but they are separate from the functions themselves. So I talked earlier about there are two different types of pricing plans. So first, you know, we have the consumption plan. And really, this is what you kind of think about when you think about serverless, because here, you know, it takes care of everything but your code, right? You know, all you have to worry about is the code. You can also do an app service plan. So basically, you know, they wrapped up the Azure Functions into an app service plan, and you pretty much take care of everything, right? You know, just like you would like a website, right? You're responsible for, you know, for the actual management of it. The reasons behind using each other. You know, again, the consumption plan, you're only paying for the functions that are running, right? And it scales out automatically. You don't have to do anything for the scale. It just happens automatically. And part of the reason why that can happen so quickly is that basically Microsoft keeps, you know, virtual servers just up and running. So they're hot, ready to go, and then they're able to pipe over your code in a heartbeat. And so, you know, once they start seeing that, you know, they need to scale up, then they're able to do that, you know, without anyone really noticing. Whereas with the, you know, why would you use an app service plan? Well, you know, really, it's if you have some existing ones that you're not using a whole lot, you know, here's where it might make sense, right? Because, you know, if I already have a website running out there, and I also need this, and I'm not using a whole lot of that functionality, or a whole lot of the bandwidth of that website, maybe that's where it makes sense. Here also, you know, if your function apps need to run continuously, right? So I mean, they're just hit every single second of the day and multiple times. Then you know you're probably going to save money with an app service plan, because at this point you know with that plan you pay a set amount per month instead of an execution cost. Also, you know, again, running longer plans, and then unless you go over to 2.0, if you want to run on Linux, you know, you need to do it with an app service plan. So as far as pricing, you know, so pricing is done by two different pieces, right? So you have the execution time and you have executions. Now execution time is charged in a gigabyte per second ratio. So basically you look at, you know, how much memory is required by that server. And again, that's not something you set, that's something that they're analyzing continuously to see how much memory is being used by that function. And then divide that by the seconds. And they give you 400,000 gigabyte seconds free a month. And then executions are 20 cents per million, and your first million per month are free. So, you know, if we were to think of a pricing example, you know, let's say we have something out there running 3 million transactions a month. You know, 1 second per execution, that's 3 million transaction seconds. And let's say it's consuming 512 megabytes, so that's 1.5 million gigabyte seconds, right? And again, you know, you get 400,000 free, so you're paying for 1.1 million, which basically means you're paying $17.60, all right, to run 3 million transactions. Now there's also a transaction cost. Again, we're running 3 million, the first million are free, so I have to pay for 2 million at 20 cents per million. So basically my grand cost for running 3 million transactions a month is $18. Try to do that with any other service, right? I mean, you can't. The baseline, well, unless you go into, way too low a level of service, with a web job, is cost more than that. So some best practices. So sure enough, the 3 shoulds, right? So functions should do one thing, right? And again, that's where you might use like an event grid to tie multiple functions together, the process and order or that type of thing. But the function itself should do one thing. You noticed in all my functions, they all, I was doing a REST API, they did one thing. They got the piece of data, or they wrote that piece of data. They didn't do multiple things. Functions should be impotent. And basically that means that, and I always have to look that up again, but it basically means that they shouldn't have any side effects. So, and more importantly, if I call it once, when I call it the second time, I should basically get the same response, unless obviously, if it's returning data, the data might have changed, but there shouldn't be a difference in what happened, right? It should have the same result type thing. And then also, they should finish as quickly as possible, right? A lot of this is because they are supposed to be simple, so you want them to return as quickly as possible, but also, to keep your cost down, right? Because you are charged by that gigabyte per second. And, so they only give you 400,000, which is still a lot, but still, once you start running a lot of transactions in a long time, your costs are going to go up. Some other general best practices, avoid long-running let me try that again. Avoid long-running functions, right? And really, because these can cause unexpected timeout issues. Like I said, by default, it's only 5 minutes. But example would be having too many dependencies in there. These dependencies you do have to load up those dependencies, and so those can cause things to get longer, especially when you look at like a node, because the way how node loads those dependencies. And along with it, you want to be considerate of the memory usage used in there. Again, getting in too many dependencies is going to add that load requirement. Also be careful of your cross-function communication, right? It really just boils down to the size of your messages. You have to be careful here. And here's where you might be looking. When you're having a lot of cross-function communication, other than maybe passing from one to another, you need to be careful because just of the cost and the complexity you're adding there. You want to write functions to be stateless, and by default they are. Again, if you really do need state, you can do durable functions, only with the preview version at the moment. But functions should be stateless, pretty much no matter what you're doing with them. And you want to be defensive with your functions. Again, these are running kind of almost in a black box, so you definitely want to be careful for that. Consider a scenario that requires a query running 10,000 rows in the database, and create a queue message for each one of those rows. What happens when you break down in the middle, right? You want to be that defensive and making sure that one, you're trapping those errors, but also so that it can go back and the next time it runs, let's say it's a scheduled task, to catch up whatever it didn't run the last time. Looking at scalability, don't mix your test and production code in the same function app. So, again, there's no extra cost for running an individual function app. So you should run a different app for your testing, for your production code. And a lot of this is because, part of it, it does share the memory space, right? So obviously you want to be, when you're doing testing, you're more susceptible to bad code. So, you do have to be careful of that. Use async, but avoid blocking calls, right? Async is the God save of everything, but just like with anything else, you want to avoid anything that's going to block that from happening. So, really probably stay away from the wait function. And it, whenever possible, receive messages in a batch. And sure enough, that's why there is the queue, because then you can receive everything in a batch. Again, what you'll see by doing this is reduced cost, but you also will see much higher performance, right? Because batching those messages just gets quicker. And then configure your host to best handle concurrency. There is the host.json file that allows you to change, make some configurations. You want to make sure how you do your batching. You can manage concurrency for the number of triggers that happen. So sure enough, you actually can handle, or you can specify how many concurrent triggers are allowed, and you should set that to what makes sense, because what will happen is I can't remember what the default is, but there is that default. But what happens is when it scales up another service for you, it's going to scale up for the exact same number of concurrency. So you want to make sure that concurrency is a good number. And then finally, one last thing, where to get started. I would say, start small, right? Replace one process or one API, right? I mean, don't try to go all out all at once, right? I mean, you will get yourself lost into details so quickly. And it's really, I think this is a general, this is me being an old man telling you, been there, done that, just try it small first. And really, integration is a great place to start, right? Because, where you need that new layer on top of an old layer to handle something, this is where a great place to start with Azure Functions really is. And with that, are there any other questions? Okay.
What were your security concerns with serverless when working with it? Were any of your concerns realized in the field?
So I haven't really seen any security concerns. I'm sorry, the question was, what any security concerns I have seen, and what were my experiences with that? I really haven't seen anything. Again, you have to treat it like anything else in the web, right? People are going to go out there. They are going to try to crash it. They are going to try to get into it. But the keys are just like any other APIs. And those do seem to work pretty well.
Azure Functions, how do you develop and test your functions and promote to production?
So the question was, how do you develop and promote in production? So that's kind of what I was showing, with the project. It's pretty much a whole project. Now, in there we saw all the functions written up together. And sure enough, that is one of the things we're doing. That's where the complexity comes up, where we talk about having a lot of different functions and with a REST API. So I have a solution with multiple projects, and each component is its own project. And then that build process I was showing, that's how I build them. I do actually create a build for each individual project. So it's a lot of overhead, but that way it gives me that flexibility that, again, I'm only having to replace what got updated. Great. Anyone here have a question? Well, awesome. I hope you guys had learned something and had a great time. And hope you have the rest of your day is awesome. Thanks, everybody. Well, it's already been posted. The slides are up online. I'll actually post it on Slack where I put my slides. So thanks, everybody.